All right. Okay, so we're starting. Hi. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here. I think we've got quite similar agendas, and so I've seen that a lot of your speakers before have been speaking generally about kind of political issues and maybe management issues. What I'd like this to be is kind of like kind of a metaphysical look at what does it mean to actually liberate the debate, because fundamentally that's something I've been looking into for about, God knows, like officially with the Echo Chamber Club about 2.5 years now. But before that, like you guys, very much involved in like an anarchist political magazine at my undergraduate 10 years ago, where we did things like we thought it was cool to have a page 3, and then we inverted the page 3 to see what the man would look like on the other side. So we got quite a lot of like attention, I suppose, from the Daily Mail. And so that's what I did as an undergraduate. I then decided I wanted to be a TV presenter, accidentally went into film instead, was a location manager for various different things. That was a side project. And then I became a salesperson, and then I was in publishing. So I think that's really where this starts, is like understanding how the media environment. So I was born in 1990, by the way, so I'm guessing that makes me probably about 8 to 10 years older than you guys. How the media environment was kind of shaping the way that we consume news. And it was a very interesting point actually around kind of 2002, 2013, because I was working for a publisher that produced the special reports of the Times newspaper, and we didn't even have a functioning website. Every publisher was talking about how you get your content free online. They weren't really thinking about how you'd monetize it, and now we're getting ourselves into all this shit. I presume you can swear at Liberate the Debate. But then the Echo Chamber Club started because I basically started working on a SaaS, a software as a service platform, which aimed to give users, the guys like you who are using Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, control over the algorithm that then fed you information. Great idea, based on like the work of Cass Sunstein and Eli Pariser. Have you guys come across, written books about, I wouldn't recommend you read them, they're totally outdated, but they were quite influential at the time, and I'll talk about it in a bit actually, around the way that algorithms were shaping our media environment, our information environment, and what did this mean for our kind of like freedom of thought, and what did that mean for deliberation, for the future of communities. So we built this fantastic SaaS product, but the problem is that no one used it. And the reason why no one used it is because no one at the time in 2014 really could see the need for it. No one really thought about how the information environment was changing. But more on top of that, it's just like there's so much investment that really goes into shaping your media environment. Like there's a reason why editorial positions are professional jobs. There's reasons why journalism is a professional job, and an editor and a curator is a professional job. It's because it's pretty hard. So I thought, okay, it's Brexit. It was about 2015, 2016. Even if only 30% of the population wanted to vote for Brexit, why was it that I didn't see any of that information at all? And I kind of class myself as an elite, I suppose. Many people wouldn't call themselves that, but well, you can hear my accent. I grew up in southeast of England. I did my undergrad at Cambridge. I've just completed a master's at Oxford. I've never really wanted for money. I've done some pretty terrible jobs, but that was my choice. I could have gone into finance if I wanted. So it's definitely part of the elite. And I was just like, why is no one seeing this kind of information? So I started thinking about ways that I could penetrate through to help people who were metropolitan elites. So let's say centre-left. Generally at the moment, it's people who are against transgender. People in general, they see that as an attack on feminism, totally against Trump, totally against Brexit. That kind of person, basically. So centre-left, definitely not as left as you can get. And what I did is I created a newsletter where I investigated my own media environment, and I saw what was it that was being shared the most on social media at that point, and I shared it with my subscribers, and it reached about 3,000 subscribers just through word of mouth. And this newsletter really did encompass a lot of different issues, because when it started off, it was like, okay, well, why don't I know anything about Brexit? Why don't I know anything about Trump? But actually, when you think about that left-right-wing binary, there's so much more information out there. So there's also things like, why don't I know anything about caste discrimination in the UK? Why isn't that being talked about as much as, radical Hinduism as much as radical Islamism? Why don't I start thinking about sense of humour? Why don't I start thinking about why we're so against war? So a lot of these topics just didn't really fit on the left-right-wing spectrum, which is why a weekly newsletter was so interesting, because I wasn't tied into an algorithm. I didn't have to have a specific format. And so it grew and grew, and then Trump was elected, and I quit my job and I moved to Berlin because it's cheaper there and it was a social enterprise. Well, it didn't make any money. Well, it still hasn't. And I kept on getting these phone calls throughout Trump being like, why are you doing this for us? You know, why are you doing this for the metropolitan elite? They didn't say that. They said for liberals and progressives, which is fair enough. Surely it's the conservatives that need this. And that's in itself is quite an interesting objection, because there are three sides to it. And this was my thinking at the time, because I've looked back at blog posts that I wrote on this. And the first is that I'm not a Trump voter. I'm not a Brexit supporter. So how on earth could I communicate in an unpatronising way with people who actually do hold those views? So that was the first point, is just, I suppose, this idea that although you can empathise with someone else and you can try to understand them, you'll never really be able to kind of speak for them, which I suppose is what quite a lot of people are wanting to do. The second argument I've forgotten, but the third argument is, why would metropolitan elite people not need a service like this, even if conservatives do need it? And when I kind of when you put it like that, it just makes the whole question entirely absurd. It just kind of shows that there are kind of these social stratas, and people do generally kind of have moral attitudes towards different other identities, and they don't tend to really introspect and look at what's going on inside their own heads and their own information environments. And, you know, I continued with this for another year, continued with interviews, continued with trying to get fundraising, and I started to realize that things were a bit amiss with the theory. So the way that I'm actually going to structure this is to kind of give you an idea of what I was trying to do at the Echo Chamber Club, and then going to talk about echo chambers specifically, which is all about kind of digital news environments. I'm not going to go into things like Cambridge Analytica and the way that ads should be run. I'm not really going to look into... Also, I'm not going to look into information warfare. Good God, I'm not going to look at Russia's influence over the information environment. But what I am going to look at is this condition of algorithms. So the way that social media platforms should be designed in order to liberate the debate. Mainly because I think that's a really important question. Because right now, you have to admit that when we are on platforms that are human designed and in no way natural, there are going to be some sort of rules as to how the debate is going to be structured. So there's a question I've got at the end of this is about what should those rules be, or should we have any rules? The truth is there are rules, so we need to think very carefully about what liberate the debate really, really means. I don't know if you guys have come across the paradox of freedom at all. One nod, two nods. Okay, the paradox of freedom is this whole idea that as soon as you start becoming more and more free, so you give people more and more freedom, actually the majority of people become less free because they start to be oppressed by the very, very free people. And so you see that in feudalism, for instance. You see that in kind of tyranny. So the point is that even if you say we have absolute free speech, that's almost kind of a contradiction in terms. So whenever you say we are pro-free speech, you're going to have to think about whereabouts on that spectrum you actually do stand, and whereabouts that kind of, how you just choose to design that. So I'm going to talk about echo chambers. I am then going to talk a bit about polarisation, which is seen to be the worst thing ever for democracy, and say why I don't think it is. And then we're going to get into some stuff that I actually haven't spoken to anyone about on a stage before. I've spoken about it in pubs, which is really diving deep into consensus-driven theory. And then finally, looking at some questions about what does it mean to be different from someone else, and kind of two different ways to portray that. And then circle that back after we've kind of discussed all those things into, okay, well, what does it mean to then design a social media platform? So that's the structure of the talk. We're going to touch on a lot of things, but it is basically this big question of, you know, if I am different from you in a way that we both think is, you know, in some way polarizing, I have an extreme emotional reaction to what you're saying, whether or not, you know, you're saying something that's anti-Semitic or you're no platforming a right-wing speaker, regardless, though, you have an emotional reaction. So if I am that different from you, how do I then become not that different from you, and we just move that into straight disagreement, and can we do that through design of platforms? Does anyone have any questions on that? Does that make sense, or should I just get on with it? Get on with it. Okay. So this is the echo chamber argument that existed from about 2001, and is still quite popular today. So do you often hear people talk about echo chambers? Yeah, it's a metaphor. It's really annoying because they say, I went into it's Chatham House rules. But I went into something recently and someone just definitively said, echo chambers exist. And I said, well, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, what aspect of echo chambers are there? Because it's fundamentally a metaphor. And if someone talks about echo chambers, they should be referring to this theory. This is basically Cass Sunstein's theory. It relies on the theory of deliberative democracy. And if you look through the literature, the most cited literature on echo chambers, it follows something that's kind of similar to this. So echo chambers are created by personalized newsfeed algorithms, which causes internet users to have a lack of access. This lack of access leads to polarization, and polarization is debilitating for democracy. So you might be able to immediately see some problems with that argument. I'll just go through some of them. Social media actually has improved access to information. More and more studies show that actually if you don't use Facebook, you're not going to see as wide a source of newspapers. And I'll be honest with you, the methodologies are a bit ambiguous, but in general there's enough of a canon now in the literature to show that actually social media is beneficial for a healthy information environment. This is the real problem with it, is that this idea of access to information is just a bit too vague. So if I have access to Liberate the Debate, which I'm sure the whole of the University of Sussex has, but I choose not to go, does that mean that I don't have access? It's your choice, and you could kind of go back through various different steps there. But equally, if I had access to Breitbart or to The Guardian, because it's freely available in the UK, I don't live in Saudi Arabia, but I choose not to go, does that mean I don't have access? It's a bizarre argument, really. Also, this whole thing about access and polarization, if I don't access information, i.e. I don't know what's going on in Icelandic politics right now, does that mean I'm polarized from a citizen in Iceland? No? It seems a bizarre thing to say. I also don't read that much about football. Does that mean that I'm polarized from a football fan? Again, it's just a bit weird. And so on that kind of line, it's like, you might say football and Iceland, it's not really part of your politics. So what information do I have to read in order to not be polarized from someone who lives in my own country? And also I have access to, the Brexit deal at the moment, but it's 585 pages in legal jargon. It's a minefield. I don't understand it. Can I access it? So just think about all those kind of different ways that access really means and what that means for free speech. I was just saying I wrote something that you guys probably disagree with, which is all around the fact that I don't think free speech is hindered on campus. And admittedly, I haven't had the experiences that you guys have had in Sussex, but I think that there's a big difference between free speech and the amplification of speech. So you don't, I have the right to be here right now, but I don't have the right to tell every single person at the University of Sussex that they should be in this room. That's just a bit weird. Okay, so access to information is too vague, and it just it's not really necessary or sufficient for polarization. But then let's really dive into this whole idea of is polarization bad for democracy? Have you guys heard that before? Polarization is debilitating for democracy.
Excessive polarization, yeah.
An excess of polarization. Okay, yeah, great. But this is the definition of polarization, right? This is what you've been taught. If you're a political scientist, or are you a psychologist?
Myself?
Yeah.
Psychologist.
Okay, so this is not the psychologist definition of polarization. It's American political theory. But this is generally when political scientists talk about it being debilitating for democracy in particular, it talks about the extent of the disagreement, not the way that a disagreement is expressed. And so I've got these nice little men and women. Unfortunately, the free icon site that I use don't have a very good woman in a skirt, but I don't even know what that means. So here we can see consensus. So you've got an ideological scale. So let's say, I don't know, let's just talk about feminism this whole time. Let's talk about abortion. So let's say on the left, or the right over there, you've got the idea that if a woman has to have an abortion, she must be shot or killed in some way. And then over here, on the left-hand side, you might have, I don't know, all babies should be born in test tubes, or it's illegal to even have a child, God knows. I mean, it could be a number of things, right? And so if there's a consensus, then you broadly see something shaping up a little bit in the center or whatever. It's generally in the center because these ideological scales are only conceived by political theorists. They can only conceive of what possibly could be on the left and right. And then here you have two, and it is two generally binary groups. Let's go a little bit more into that, though, because I've just spoken about it as if it's a single issue, and you're right to kind of call up on the fact that it is, you know, how far apart the disagreement is. So you're more polarized if the groups are further apart on this weird ideological scale that we don't really know if it's appropriate or not. If there's quite a lot of people who actually sit in between those two groups, then you're not quite as polarized because there's people who can kind of talk in between you. Again, weird. And then this is the identity politics argument. So the whole idea that perhaps if, you know, these two groups, if you can easily predict what someone's opinion is on the housing crisis, if you know what they think about abortion. So in ideas, if these kind of like ideas come in clusters, then that's really, really bad. I also have a problem with that because isn't that just party politics? I don't really get the idea. I don't really get what's against identity politics right now. But that's probably something we can talk about another time. So the reason why political scientists, though, effectively say that polarization is debilitating for democracy is because governments have to make decisions and that people have to be happy enough with the decisions that basically it's stable. So the more consensus there is, the more people who are kind of grouped around the middle, then the more stable the democracy is and everyone's happy to be there. This is something I'm really going to drill into later in the presentation. At this point, if I was doing this normally, and I'm going to say it now, do you know who else really likes consensus? It's authoritarian governments. And yeah, there's another reason as well. It's just that, yeah, there might be all those people in the center, but just because these guys aren't big enough to be able to cause enough of a protest, does that mean that their views should just be discarded? So you've got these guys, and I've already talked about how weird the ideological scale is. Just doesn't make sense. So you can probably tell where my thinking is on this. It really does mean that we need to start going back to basics and understand how can we be different and still get along. And again, this is kind of the point where if I was doing this presentation to a normal general audience who've just got, you know, want to get off to the pub in London or whatever, I'd kind of end it here and just be like, this is your big question, go away and think about it. But it's true. You need to think about like this idea of how much consensus can there really be in a country for us to get along. And to be honest with you, I'll also say that I'm not talking about the extremists in this case. Like, I'm not talking about whether or not you have to get along with Donald Trump, whatever. I'm talking about whether or not you can get along with someone who voted for Donald Trump, because, you know, that's really important. And I don't think the issue here is all about the level of the disagreement. I actually think it is, because I qualified that before, I think it's all about the nature of the disagreement. And there is also evidence to show that that is getting worse and worse and worse. So this is from 2016, before the election. So you can say frustration, fear, and anger among partisans. And by the way, all research on polarization is centered on America. So yeah, and also it only ever centers across this kind of binary of Democrats over to Republicans. So if you guys ever want to do a PhD on polarization in Europe, trust me, it will get published because there's nothing there. But this is still quite interesting, right? And I did check out the methodology for this, and it is actually quite sound. It is a self-reported survey, but I think you can trust people when they say whether or not they feel angry, frustrated and afraid in ways that self-reported surveys you sometimes can't really trust. So yeah, this is the big problem as far as I'm concerned. And this is kind of the question that I'm looking at right now is how do we get these groups to like each other? So is it possible to get this guy here, getting along with this guy here and just being like, look, we disagree, that's fine. And to be honest with you, my answer has to be yes. A, because it's what I'm basing my career on. But B, I mean, if we don't believe that, then let's just, you know, fuck it. Let's just go to Berghain. Like, what's the point in, like, working in politics? And that we've got two options really right now, is between hedonism and nihilism, if we don't believe there's a way forward. And I don't really like the sound of either of those options. So I get pushed back on this a lot. And my only answer is that I have hope, and let's see if we can do something about it. But we need to do something about it in order to radically shake up the system. So I've spoken for about 25 minutes. Have we got any questions so far? Do I have to repeat the question? Oh, right.
It's more with the ideological scale,
Mm-hmm.
how it's showed. It was into a bit, but it's sort of the volatility of the people. I feel sort of, say what spreads people out more. I don't think it quite brings in this sort of willingness to fight. Like even like going back to America, where you've got like nationalists and sort of left-wing like Antifa types going at each other. It just seemed that the scale, if it had like this sort of hinted at like just how, I guess, volatility as well as getting.
Can you just define volatility so I know exactly what you mean by that?
Like the knee-jerk reaction to something. There's like this refusal to hear out the other side. Essentially, so it's going straight to violence. Willingness to hear out violence rather than hear out the other.
So that I entirely agree with you, because that's what I think the problem is. So the question,
There's more like a half statement.
yeah, how do I repeat that?
So, is it?
No, I know what you said, but I'm just trying to think, how do I summarize it for the microphone? Can I just answer the question? Okay. I agree with you. I think that the violence side of it is really bad. It's just to kind of highlight that political scientists, and not psychologists, but political scientists generally do just think of it as the extent of the disagreement across this ideological scale. So I agree with you. I think it's highly inefficient. The other thing I would say, though, about Antifa versus the nationalists is that American press, for all its amazing qualities, is incredible. It loves to sensationalize very minor groups. So,
What I think it was like Charlottesville.
yeah. Yeah, that was a real clusterfuck. So I think there's only 5,000 members of the KKK, and how many is like 270 million people in the United States? Like, if you think about, if we're talking about the problem is amplification of speech, my God, has the KKK got shitloads of publicity for how much people actually care about them. It's like, did you see that demo for the EDL demo in Manchester, where there was about 20 people who turned up? Did you see the Twitter? And everyone was like, why on earth are we even paying attention to this when there's so few people? But because we love a sensational story and we love to be morally outraged, and it sells shitloads of stuff. Like, so in that way as well, it's kind of a question back to you guys about like, how much do you amplify these views? Because they do have free speech. They were able to protest if they don't contravene hate laws in the wider UK, maybe not in the University of Sussex, which seems like a little microcosm. But yeah, it is interesting about the fact that these huge debates get hugely amplified. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, I can't remember who it was, but some famous figure is often quoted as saying that politics is the opiate of the masses. And so my question is basically, are we seeing the problems that we're seeing now in terms of hypersensitivity because politics has become too important in people's lives?
Oh, I don't know if I can answer that question. I also don't know where that quote is from. Politics is the opiate of the masses.
Well, Marx was religion.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it could be a paraphrase. But,
Yeah, I'd get it if it was religion. I don't know about politics being the opiate of the masses. And do I think there's hypersensitivity at the moment? I think that in general there's evidence to show that only 30% of the population is even slightly engaged in politics. So the
of that 30%, would you say that there's an increase in sensitivity?
I really don't know. I really don't. What I would say is I think there's been an increase in equality. So I think that, like, and I am a feminist, so no matter what feminists say, we are becoming gradually more equal. And I'm noticing that as well, like the amount of panels that I'm invited on where I might not just be the only woman, which, by the way, is really shit, is decreasing in size. And I think that the closer that you do get to your goal, because there are more people behind you, it might seem that there's kind of like this mass hysteria. Do you see what I mean? But I don't know of any studies really that would say that we're becoming more sensitive. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotes. Spiked runs this whole thing the whole time about how sensitive we are. I'm not a huge fan of Spiked. I think they also sensationalize things. And I think that they pretend to be the common man when actually they're not. Like Brendan O'Neill has a pretty nice place. So I don't really know if I can answer that question. I'm sorry.
I think that perhaps one of the other problems with polarization is that it's not just a kind of pure spectrum of thought which people disagree on in terms of policy. I think it's more about the idea that as polarization happens, there's different ontologies which fundamentally underpin these different philosophies. So basically, like the left will not even see the world in a similar way. So they'll be looking. I think there's this kind of analogy. I don't know where it's from. It's like in America, at least, everybody's looking at two different screens at the moment, and you can either choose to look left or look right, but essentially they're not what they're both watching like completely different shows, and so they can't understand each other. Like, it's not even that you can have a sensible discussion about policy, which might be the case in a more homogeneously politicized country. It's actually that the jump is something that can't possibly be made without a severe change in your life.
I think you might have seen my next slides. Yeah, I do think that as well. In fact, I'll answer that when I get on to kind of what I think. Any other questions? Cool. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's reframe the problem. This is such a dad joke, but I loved it. Yeah, it's just like, I hope everyone enjoys that. So I do think that when you kind of get to a stalemate in politics or political theory or in philosophy in general, you have to kind of take a step back and kind of go through what we've just done and go, like, what is polarization? What does this look like? How are we going to design for this in the future? So I'm going to take two big points today and talk about evaluating consensus and also a new way of looking at difference, which kind of you've already illustrated. So let's first off evaluate consensus. So the way that I've actually chosen to do this is by talking about three major movements that you've probably heard of that all value consensus. So one is, yay, the Enlightenment. Like, how many people are banging on about the Enlightenment at the moment? It happened 250 years ago. But it's really important to think about. I put the Enlightenment in inverted commas as well, because essentially we're looking at kind of an ersatz Enlightenment values, because actually if you read the history of the Enlightenment period and of the political thinkers who were there, they weren't all totally behind this. They saw the problems, basically, in Enlightenment values that we now take so to our hearts. I don't know if you know the RSA, the Royal Society of Arts, right next to Charing Cross. They talk about, they getting the coffee house back and, rationality plus evidence equals scientific method. Yay. And you're just like, look, the Enlightenment served this amazing purpose, which was before the king and the church were like, we tell you the truth. And it was if you read Habermas's structural transformations, which by the way is partly true and partly not, so but it does throw up some interesting things. If you read that, you realise that the king kind of was meant to represent the people, but didn't actually have to represent the views of the people. He got to represent the people because he'd been divinely ordained. And so what the Enlightenment did is kind of overthrow this, inequality, really. And what was really interesting is that this thing here is the public opinion is endowed with a rational objectivity. So the more people that you get together, the more likely you are to get the truth. There's a really good point that's made about why is it that opinion is just bullshit, but public opinion, fucking hell, better listen to that. But when we think about Enlightenment values, we do think about this idea that we can reach a consensus through rationality and evidence, so through some succinct thought and the evidence that we have. So I studied history and philosophy of science at my undergrad, and what you realise very quickly is that this scientific method is the best that we have, but it's not perfect. So you can never say that we have the truth right now. Otherwise Isaac Newton, yeah, he nailed it. But we know, Einstein came along, and God knows what's going to happen next in the scientific method. But then scientists say, well, it's the best that we have so far, so we should trust it, which is why I kind of think we should do something about climate change. We've got to be really careful about thinking that this is the truth, and that the consensus that we reach here is objective. So whenever anyone says to you, you know, we've got to go back to Enlightenment values, really think about what that means, because it's just something that everyone, you know, it's like, as Americans would say, it's like arguing against apple pie and motherhood. No one would do it. So the second thing is deliberation. So again, everyone sees deliberation as this amazing thing. I put up a shitload of quotes there. But the aim is, again, it had a very specific aim. You know, it had a very specific agenda. It had a very specific political agenda. And it was to make sure that citizens can participate in a democracy in a way that wasn't simply voting once every 4 years. So it was actually trying to get people talking. And I've highlighted here reasoning together, the exercise of power to reasons, disciplines. You can kind of see it's very similar language to this rational model. Cohen, political scientist. I could really bitch about deliberation, if any of you guys want to. And this is also really interesting. So this is something that we're still in the fallout period from, because a lot of the guys who are, and girls, women, men and women who are in power right now are kind of grew up through Labour period, say the 90s. So they're about 20 years older than me. And they really worry that we don't have the consensus like we did in the 1990s. And the reason why we had that consensus in the 1990s is because the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989. Communism was over. You know, Fukuyama, the end of history. Woo! And of course you'd be like on this great high because like the Cold War was over, and that was absolutely psychologically devastating. And again, we can kind of see like a hark back to the Enlightenment period. Anthony Giddens talking about a public arena in which all controversials can actually be solved through public dialogue. Imagine that. Like, there's no incommensurable views. One nation, shared values and purpose. And what this actually ended up being was a bit of a technocracy, which is why I think we're seeing a problem that we are now. So the idea is that we all know we're trying to like get towards equality and progression. And the only thing that is worth talking about is how we get there. It's a technical question. It's a scientific question. There's no point in talking about politics, because that's the only thing that we have to do now. And that attitude really has pervaded through politics, I think, for the last 30 years. You can fight me on it, like lots of people do, but those are three reasons why I think that we really do value consensus today. As the Enlightenment period, everyone always talks about deliberation as being the panacea of thought, and if it was, then God knows I'm getting way too much time up on the stage. And also this kind of Labour movement, the third way. So let's just really think about rationality. So rationality, as I just said, is not really something which is totally objective. I don't know if anyone would argue with me on that. No one? Yeah. Who said that? Okay, so if we are all sat down, and let's say we're going to say that Peter's been pretty bad. He's done a big crime. He's murdered someone, we think. And we're in a court of law. There's 12 of us trying to figure out. Police have kind of come and given us evidence, and there's kind of a process in order to understand with beyond reasonable doubt whether or not Peter is guilty of this crime. That, I would say, is like a good use of reason and of good use of rationality, because there's a very clear purpose to the reason why we're all together. Whereas the actual public sphere is most of the problems that we most of the problems that we discuss in the public sphere are actually to do with what should we be talking about? How should we talk about these things? It's not about, you know, what's your and all of politics is taken up of what is Theresa May going to do about Brexit? And to be honest, there's only a couple of options there because she's been given the mandate that she's given. But all our conversations that we have down the pub, we don't have to be talking about like work-based stuff. Like, how are we going to get this marketing campaign out? Because we clearly have to do that. It's more about, okay, let's talk about feminism. What does feminism mean to you? Like, what are your feelings about that? How do you think feminism should be defined? And so that's why the emphasis on rationality, I think, is just completely wrong, because it's not the way that we operate. We're all trying to, and it's also like, why did you choose to come here tonight rather than have dinner with your mate? Like, that was also an exercise in like public sphere rationality. Was the rational thing to come to this? Maybe you'll know afterwards. Hopefully the answer is yes. So yeah, there's just a big question mark. Cool. So, next slide. I'm talking about the ideological scale here. So we've kind of gone into why I don't think this is a very good visualization, but this is still fundamentally a visualization that a lot of political scientists use. Just because political scientists use it, by the way, doesn't mean that the general population views it like this, because I don't know how many of you have thought about polarization and disagreement in this much depth before. I can imagine that you have, given where you are, but it's just a visualization. So this is actually how I think disagreement should be conceptualized, and I've only done this for the first time today, so hopefully it makes sense. So instead of so what I've tried to do is zoom in on one of those characters and imagine him looking around almost, and so here you are, the self, and what do you see around you? So you see groups all over the place, some of which are, seem very close, some of which are big, some of which are small, and all of those people are the other. And again, if we think about, so do you remember we talked about one issue, which was abortion before? So you might think about the self, and sometimes you generally can only think about one thing at a time. And that, you can swim and you can think, or you can, you know what I mean? So generally you can only think about one topic at a time, so we might just see all these different people on different topics, and then it might just switch a bit when we think of another topic. We might see like Adam move over here, and Sarah move over there, and Ahmed move somewhere else. But this is just, I think, a much better way of trying to understand what disagreement looks like. It's not just someone who's on the right or the left. It's someone who has multiple different views on multiple different topics that is just kind of grouped in a slightly different way. And sure, there might be some identity groups that kind of cluster together over multiple issues, but fundamentally, whether or not it's you and you're in a family relationship, or just in a relationship full stop, my God, do you realise there's the self and the other when you're in a relationship, which I'm sure many of you are. So this could be one person, the self, or it could be a group of people, it could be a family, it could be a football club, it could be a country, it could be the West. The point is just to think about it, the self and the other. And why do I think this is better? Because I think that instead of kind of viewing it along the spectrum, you can kind of really get into the depths of what these people are as people, because you're viewing it kind of through your own eyes. And you can kind of think, do I fear these people, really? Do I respect them? Because quite often we don't feel respect for people with different views. It's really hard to, anyway. Perhaps I just feel apathetic towards them. Do I really give a fuck about these guys over here? Like, they don't affect me. And so in that way, is the apathy good or bad? Do they need our help and we're ignoring them? Or are they actually just part of some weird, I don't know, running club? And what issues do I consider my own position and other people's? So are there times when that previous question about the fact that accessing information alone, so because I don't access politics in Iceland, does that mean I'm polarized from Iceland? So again, that question of where does it matter and where doesn't it? And I actually think that this is a much better description of what's happened in the internet era. So through the internet, I'm going to sound fucking either naive or patronizing here. I got my first mobile phone when I was 11 years old in 2001. When did you guys generally get your first mobile phone? I was 8. 8. Yeah, people go on about how digitally literate this generation is.
My mum's old.
Yeah. Oh, really? Well done. So what I kind of want to say, though, is that before, so Luciano Floridi, who, I'm on camera, he's an excellent philosopher. Take that bit out. He talks about the kind of what the internet really has done, and that mobile device really has done, is it separated out your presence from where you're located. And I actually think that's a really valuable philosophical proposition. So he talks about the idea that I no longer have to be in a bank to do banking. And actually that's kind of revolutionary in terms of who am I, existentialism. But what it also means is that we can actually create very niche groups. So before it might just be that, have you guys aware of a word called homophilous thinking? So homophily is kind of basically one of the oldest social science principles that exists. It's always been that groups group together based on their age, sex, race, education level, these kind of factors. What it's meant through the internet is that we're not just kind of, we don't have to be best friends with the girl who lives in our village who's the same age as us. We can actually be best friends with anyone in the world. And so that means that interests have really niche, like got really niche, and we've really delved in some really cool stuff. And so what this means is that the other now is just huge. And whereas before, when we could easily talk about the working class and the bourgeoisie, that now doesn't make any sense. So that's why I really like this, and yeah, feedback on the visualization would be great. And also why I've been talking about this for quite a long time, the crisis of meaning. So because all of these groups have kind of come together and fallen apart, there's been some great studies, even from the 90s, on how do you create language that identifies who you are on the internet. So let's say there used to be quite a lot of forums for black women in the 90s, and there's a good book called Race in Cyberspace, which talks about, one of the issues it talks about is the way that black women used to identify another black woman being in the forum and not some rogue imposter by talking about their hair. And so that would be kind of the language that they'd use to identify another person, and then they kind of develop norms as a result of that. So there's quite a lot of words in that lexicon that we just wouldn't understand at all. And sometimes we appropriate words. So, for example, the Donald subreddit appropriated the phrase red pill. You know, have you guys come across? Yeah. I speak to older people quite often. They're like, what the fuck is this? So obviously a matrix reference, and the red pill now has an entirely different meaning. So that when you might hear people talking about taking a red pill, and you're like, oh, you know, been to the doctor recently, that kind of thing. But actually they're talking about something entirely different. So the meaning that they have is entirely different. The problem is because this is entirely new, and the heuristics that we have online isn't kind of like the heuristics that we used to have when we came across someone from Liverpool. I don't know if there's any Liverpudlians in here, but they've got quite a distinctive accent. So when they start using words in a different way, you can go, hey, I need to actually listen. I need to think about what this translation looks like. We just don't have that online. So I talk about the crisis of meaning because I think that meaning genuinely is in crisis. Because yes, we've got all these amazing versatile languages, but we just haven't figured out that we need to start listening a little bit more and figuring out, oh, when you use the word feminism, perhaps you mean something entirely different to me. So Ella Whelan, for instance, Riss has written a book. Have you guys know Ella Whelan? Oh, really? Yeah. I think she's incredibly courageous, but I also think she's wrong on quite a lot of things. So she's written a book called Fun, Freedom and an End, What Do Women Want? Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. And to be honest with you, I think she uses the word feminism in a way that's entirely different to the way that I use it, whether or not like that's the emotions that she attaches to it, or actually the genuine referent. So anyone study philosophy in here? Yeah. So you know, like Tarski, Frege, Davidson all talk about the referent and that kind of thing. So yeah. Okay. So this is the situation that we're in. So I'm kind of working on literal English to English translation tools right now to see whether or not that kind of intervention. So if you say to someone, if someone reads an article and then you say, oh, it doesn't actually mean that, it means something else, whether or not that changes their attitude from being fearful about the article to being curious because they've realized that they've misinterpreted it. So that's kind of another side project that I'm working on. So what does this mean for consensus in the public sphere? And I've never done this slide either, so we're going to have to see how this goes. So this is the self, and this is the other. And what we see in the public sphere is continual contestation for definitions and meaning. So it might be, okay, let's think about hysteria. Are you guys familiar with hysteria and kind of feminist history? So hysteria used to be a disease that pretty much all women were diagnosed with through the Victorian period. It basically meant that they were kept in the house, they weren't allowed outside, they weren't allowed to read books, they weren't allowed to have sex, so they just went quite mad because there was no stimulant at all. So no one really gets hysteria anymore, but hysterical kind of, well, it's a Greek translation, but the point is that hysteria, for instance, might, you know, decline a bit and then it just might leave entirely because it's not something worth talking about from the public sphere because we get enough evidence. And then it might be that some aspects get smaller, and so we don't need to talk about them anymore. Some get much bigger. I don't know which one this one's going to do. It's going to get smaller. But basically, the landscape changes as public sphere dialogue goes on. We change our definitions. We change our meaning. And I'm a big fan of someone called Chantal Mouffe, who you might be studying through Marxist theory. Okay, so Chantal Mouffe is an agonist, and she calls this, and I've been told not to use this word, but I'm going to try it out, is kind of like the fight for the hegemony. So the hegemony is what is the general acceptance of the way this word is used? And we see this going on all the time with words like inequality, for instance. We all have a different idea of what inequality really means. And like I say, there will be some groups whose meaning will, they'll get much bigger in size because more people will get on board with that. Some will get smaller, and sometimes the issue will just completely disappear. Mental health is something that's really getting much bigger, and much more meaning is being attached to that. So yeah, I've spoken about feminism. I've spoken about the public sphere contest and the way that I kind of see these things happening. And by the way, this isn't rational. So this is kind of a way of visualizing this that is in no way rational, which you might like, you might not like. Some people don't like it because it means that it doesn't really give legitimacy to the decisions that we make in the public sphere. So the idea that when we vote for someone, they have the legitimacy to then rule over us. But this model doesn't allow for that. I don't know. Anyway, I hope that's been clear. I'd really love some feedback on that, actually. So how do we get around this? And I kind of touched on it a bit. So this is another thing that I've written about, and I think this is a personal exercise that people have to do. So mutual recognition is something that's been developed by Calypso Nicolaides, who is actually a really good political theorist. And yeah, it's basically the idea of that when I see someone who calls themselves a pro-life feminist, or I'm a pro-choice feminist, do I choose to see our differences? Or do I choose to see our similarities? And let me be absolutely clear. If I met a pro-life feminist, I would absolutely fight for the right to have an abortion. But do you know what? Actually, pro-life feminism has shitloads of goals, which I think are totally admirable. So quite a lot of them are just looking to make sure that basically that having a child is in no way detrimental for a woman, so to the extent that they never have to have an abortion. So that's the way I see pro-life feminism. But I know that previously a lot of people have seen it a little bit like this. So there was a lot of animosity over the Women's March. And to be honest with you, this has to be something that we just talk about. We have to talk about mutual recognition, and it can't be something you bestow on other people. It's something that you really have to do yourself. And I'm not saying that anyone in this room isn't in the habit of doing this all that often, but quite often when I get angry, which is fairly, I don't know how frequent it is compared to other people, let's say once every 10 days, I really have to kind of step back and understand that and understand definitions and why someone's coming from somewhere, and then try and see our similarities and our differences. Or I have to just go, look, I haven't got the time for this, I'm just going to be apathetic. So I think this is a really good model for thinking about how that original question of can we disagree without fear? How can we disagree without frustration? Good, it's 7. So I think I'm running pretty much to time. So what version of democracy enables disagreement? Because I've spoken against deliberation. I haven't really spoken about liberal democracy, but liberal democracy kind of took deliberation as being a good thing, in that they basically kind of appropriated it, I suppose. And the one that, if you were to go away, this is Chantal Mouffe. I think she's wonderful. She's not met me yet, but I'll carry on emailing. And she's developed this thing called agonism, and it really is rooted in discourse theory. So everything that I've been speaking about is really in discourse theory, as opposed to... So a lot of political theories start off with a big normative claim, like we must ensure that democracy does not... basically, the state does not intervene on individual liberty, which is a liberal democracy. And then they go about trying to figure out how they do that, which is a bit weird because then it doesn't work. Whereas what agonism has done is they're like, okay, well, we're inherently tribal people. We inherently have identities. How do we create a democratic version of our tribalism? How do we create democracy out of disagreement? So there's a book that she wrote in 1985 called Hegemony and Socialist Practice. So she is a Marxist. So she does come from the Marxist sphere. So I don't know what you'll take from that. And she basically advocates quite a lot of what I've said today. And that's why I think that the public sphere should be designed for disagreement using principles of the self and the other, rather than that ideological spectrum. But we do need consensus in the government sphere. We do need consensus in institutions. Otherwise, we just reach a deadlock. We do need an idea of what truth is, fundamentally. So that's my proposition for designing internet platforms. This is the question that I said we were going to end on. Because it is interesting to think about this with regard to internet platforms and communication platforms. And yeah, these are my contact details. And yeah, I suppose that was quite a lot to get through. Was it quite a lot to get through? I've never done it like that before. But I hope you got something out of it. And yeah, where am I wrong, basically?
With your...
All right, yeah, take them.
Yeah, so with your public spheres thing you did before, where they were moving around,
This thing.
yeah, what I think it's missing as well are the certain groups who are deliberately trying to essentially ram their opinions down the self's throat, essentially. Like, lots of it say that they look over, you're looking at all these groups, but there's certain groups where they're right up in your face to the point where you can't really, it's like with the whole algorithm thing, where you can't really see everything because you're getting bombarded with, well, propaganda, essentially, if that makes sense, in the public sphere.
So, just so I'm clear and understanding what you're saying, because you could say certain groups which make you think that you're thinking of a certain group, but you don't want to say.
Well, no. I mean, just in general, everyone's got their propaganda that they want to send out. But with this sort of public sphere, there are generally more which get put into your...
Like the Ku Klux Klan or like Antifa and that.
Oh yeah, like so the sensationalist side, or say even the BBC or the Guardian would have their own sort of propaganda biases type of things. But there are others which are more reclusive and just sort of go on and they don't try to bother, and others that are actually trying to just pretty much, what's the term I'm looking for? Like a way of recruiting, but they just force these ideologies in, like, right into your own personal space rather than you looking around.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Like
so
they're
that's
like
what
it's like
that's what
influences.
that-
There's certain groups that are trying much harder to influence.
Yeah, I tried to show that. I don't know where the little one is where he gets really big. So I tried to show that with this guy.
Okay, yeah.
It really again kind of back to that thing around access, right? So it's like, can I be free from this as well? So in what choices do I have to be free from this particular ideology and this particular point of view? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and just like how there's certain groups just getting completely overshadowed.
Oh yeah, of course,
blocked out.
yeah, and it really pisses me off. Yeah, and I think we might disagree on what those groups are as well.
I think it's general most. I see left, right. I really like propaganda and the whole influencing sort of thing. But yeah, it seems like there's more blinkered, like now for people, I think there's a lot more blinkered vision.
So there's a
rather
book
than
you
seeing
should read.
everything.
It's by James Williams. It's called Stand Out of Our Light, and
Okay.
it's not talking necessarily about what you're saying.
We're still figuring out.
Yeah, so there's a book called James Williams called Stand Out of Our Light, and I think that the main way that this is being done is because you can only really get in someone's face if you've got the money behind it, and because it's always a power thing, right? So and quite a lot of the money that's being put behind these things right now is on digital advertising, and so James Williams, it's really short, it's free to access, but you guys don't care about that because you're in a university, and you have free access to everything, I presume. It's really easy to read, and basically he talks about the difference between persuasion and coercion in so before there used to be are you guys familiar with Aesop's fable? So there was the north wind and the sun, and they were like, let's get into this battle over who to take off this man's coat, and the wind blew and blew and blew, and the man just wrapped it around him really tightly and it didn't work. So Aesop says that's coercion. And then the sun beamed down brightly, and the man of course took off his coat, and that's seen as persuasion. That's a really good thing. Whereas James Williams now says that's completely redundant now. We need to think about the difference between persuasion and seduction, because online everything is persuasive. So that distinction might be helpful for what you're talking about. Any other questions? At the back? Okay.
I'm necessarily disagreeing with you. I think the crisis of thinking is like, I think you got that spot on. I've been thinking about that for a while. I think it's more prevalent. I think it's easy for us because we're kind of like internet fluent, so to speak, that we're kind of in the communities and in the circles who are thinking about these things. But it's like, it seems to me that there are kind of really polarized arguments happening in this kind of like internet community. And sure, you have kind of like old timers or whatever in the UK who are getting upset about Brexit, or in America about Trump or whatever. Like my dad, for example, is like very anti-Trump, and like fair enough, but he's kind of active online as well. In short, though, when it comes to this kind of like definition of words, I think that's kind of a more young thing, at least, and maybe it links in with the kind of, I know it's a bit boring at this point, but the postmodernism that you could argue we're seeing nowadays among certain people. It's like there are people out there who believe that no definition is inherently correct. That we can't. It's not that if there's like a public consensus about a word like racism, for example, or sexism, what that means, or feminism, what that means to us, like as a society, for us to be able to have a discourse about it, we have to agree on a definition. But there are people who think, no, it's like, fuck your definition. I'm going to define it like this, and this is because, this is my lived experience or whatever. And yeah, I think that's super difficult, and I don't know how we're going to get there. And I think it's eventually going to seep out and start affecting everyone, not just these kind of smaller communities.
But what you just described actually is what I was trying to get at with the public sphere contest, is kind of saying, fuck you, fuck your definition, I want a different definition. But as long as they're kind of very clear about what their new definition is, and that can be translated, so that's why I said I'm working on translative tools from English to English, then I think that's fine. Because let's take the word racism, for instance. Like racism, I don't know the etymology of racism, but I do know that 20 years ago, racism was literally just meant like physical violence against someone as a result of their race, pretty much. Let's say that was the hegemonic definition. And it is now that the hegemonic definition and like societal definition is actually talking about racist structures. So structures that inhibit people of various different ethnicities into getting great healthcare, jobs, whatever. So actually that contestation of different definitions has to change through time. In the same way that I spoke about hysteria being once a focus point and seeing as a medical condition is now actually seen as completely irrelevant. And I think that's called progress. So I think that's a good thing.
Sure, but I mean, again, I'm going to bring in like the extent idea. It's like to an extent, it's you can have disagreement and you can have people redefining words. Fair enough, but it's like you have to operate in society with a certain amount of respect and understanding, and maybe translation is going to help. But I'd say there are those who feel so strongly about their definition that they're willing to shut down your definition and not even think about that. And not even perhaps have a conversation because your definition is just plain wrong. And it's like, we're not going to find common ground. And so, I don't know.
I agree, but I think that's to do with the fear aspect. So that's why I kind of spoke about, if mutual introspection turns into something that everyone starts practicing, and you're like, oh, that's not going to happen. And then I kind of go back to that slide, which is like, well, I have to believe this is going to happen. Yeah. But I do think that kind of only starts with yourself, and it also starts from kind of talking about it in this kind of way to other people.
For sure.
So,
yeah. No, I think, and maybe we'll be able to get there, but it is kind of like it's a cultural shift, It's leading by example, I guess. Just kind of like showing that, yeah, I get that you define your things like this, and I define it like this. Let's kind of like accept that as the premises or whatever. Kind of move forward.
Exactly, and it's like the whole thing around feminism. It's like, well, loads of my friends are like, why on earth would you hang out with this pro-life feminist? Yeah. I'm like, well, I see our similarities more than I see our differences.
Yeah. I will also point out, though, that, I kind of keep reminding myself, and maybe you'll refute it, I don't know, but if you're emotionally charged about a subject, it's like, I'm not black, and so, and I'm not really a minority at all. And it's so, and I use that argument reluctantly because, I hear it so often and it's kind of like lost its meaning to an extent, but it's like, I haven't been discriminated against really. I've been called nasty things and gotten really upset about it, and I'm like, man, it's like, you don't really know what you're talking about in terms of the experience and everything, and so I'm not going to get super upset about definitions. So it's easy for me to say, yeah, we have our separate definitions and it's all beautiful and we can like have a nice dialogue, but it's like some of these things don't affect me.
And some of these things have to move on. And to be honest with you, the only thing that really changes things in politics is anger. Like, everyone wants to like take the emotion out of politics, but that's the only real way that progress happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you guys are saying as well with the emotion in politics. good versus evil, and they get so it's almost like, you know, there's lots of people still, you know, students here who still like the sort of Harry Potter franchise, and that is just good versus evil.
J.K. Rowling, love that shit.
But there's lots of these influences in society of these books, good, you know, even the Hunger Games, things like that. And
Tolkien, the Bible.
yeah, but it all comes into like, say, instead of like, oh, this is an opinion here, and here's another one, let's talk about it. It's like, no, that's evil, and that has to be stamped out, and that's what I see a lot.
That's,
Whether it's left or right, there's this view of it's good and evil.
but that's not new, is what I'm trying to say. Is that's why I'm like with Tolkien, like it's not new. It's actually just like inherent in kind of like Anglo-Christian Islam, which is why we need to preserve the languages of Africa and South America, because they have completely different myths and they have completely different attitudes towards right and wrong. But yeah, we are losing that, which we need to preserve it, in my opinion. But yeah, it's not a new thing. Like, and this whole good evil thing, like my father, he hates me talking about it. A hypothetical man that I'm very close to is very conservative, and I'm not as conservative. And one thing he hates is the fact that everyone on the left paints everyone on the right as being evil. And I just, I mean, it was an easy win for a bit politically, right? But now it's like there's a backlash. It's not working out anymore. It's endemic to our language and our culture. I can't see us stamping it out, even in like if we have children and the environment doesn't implode our children's lifetime. But there are other ways, but it's definitely not a new thing. Do you want the microphone?
Just wanted to go back to what you said about anger being the driving force behind change, and I was just kind of wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on.
Yeah. So there's this amazing philosopher called Maisha Cherry, who's writing a lot on anger at the moment, and think about like every single time you've had to do something which has been really, really tough. Oh right. God. Yeah. Every single time you've had to do something that has been like against the status quo, or is like rising up against other people who are very different to you, there needs to be some sort of emotion and passion behind that, whether or not that's a desire for change, and that usually comes from anger of some sort, which I think is one of the reasons why charities play off anger quite a lot. They play off sadness and they play off anger, is because it's the only way that actually gets you to do something. But rationality alone, I won't go into that. Rationality alone is never going to really change anything, because what you're doing is you're just relying on what social structures you already have and the definitions that you already have. An example I'll give you about definition actually is, there's one philosopher in the room. When I was studying philosophy, there was kind of one of the, I suppose you could say it was an axiom, is that pain, like the presence of pain is kind of shows that there is something wrong with the body. And they go through like behaviorism, like arguments and all that kind of thing. And it took in 2018 for a woman to stand up on stage and go, well, actually, what about period pain? Period pain is something that I experience every month. And that is not a sign of something being wrong with my body. That's the sign of something working. And I heard this and I was like, oh my God, I'm nearly 29. And I just actually not even questioned that principle. And I'd experienced that pain countless times. And so it's that whole thing around anger and emotion, in the sense that you have to see something, really look inside yourself, realize that something's different, and be like, what the fuck? Like, how is it, to then go out and kind of tell people about it? You know, so that's kind of what I'm getting at. But I haven't, Maisha Cherry is, sorry. Yeah. Maisha Cherry is this Californian black woman, amazing philosopher, which is quite rare in philosophy departments. He's writing a lot about this at the moment. I've given you a shitload of reading. I'm not assuming. Cool. Yeah. Just come and sit in the audience.
All right. I'm kind of thinking of a question as I speak. I think my question is sort of about, I'm not sure I got your panacea in a sense. Firstly, I think that you want to see a kind of end of echo chambers in the kind of hostile sense. So you don't want to see people you want to see people not have an understanding of other views, right?
So I want us to be able to be different and get along.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think that's a bit of an engineering contradiction. I think that without a kind of hegemonic definition of truth and a hegemonic kind of discussion that we can have with reason, that emotion that you just kind of talked about now is self-destructive for a society. Like it will fragment and destroy the society until the society becomes new societies. Because I think that in any political formation there has to be a kind of exclusionary definition which prevents, so like any concept has inclusive inclusive categories, but those categories have to be exclusive as a result. So like the water bottle is everything that's not that water bottle, and so a society which exists has to exclude all other societies. And once you try to bring in a million definitions of truth, surely this completely destroys a society.
So this is kind of why I said this. So that the government sphere will have. So the government sphere here will have. Because this is a really important point, actually, you're right, I will take a note of that. I haven't really made that very clear. There will always be kind of in whatever community that you're in, whether or not that's your family, your country, or your dance class, there will be kind of like accepted words and accepted definitions for things. I don't know like how many times you take up a new hobby, but it's really exhausting trying to like figure out what the fuck everyone's talking about. So that in itself is kind of like already the hegemonic standard. And you're right, that is totally exclusionary. And we do need that, and we need that in the government sphere in order to create some sort of progress. But that does not mean to say that we cannot have these other smaller little ideas kind of nipping on the bud of like refuting whether or not that's the right thing to be talking about, what the right definition is. That's why I think we need like if you see these two things as being separate, like government sphere and government institutions, which by the way, this is not a typical, if you study politics, this isn't a typical way of dividing it up. They generally divide it up according to private and public sphere, which I just don't think makes sense. But government sphere, think about government institutions, like literally the Work and Pensions Department, and then everything else. And so, yeah, we do need some sort of like truth in the government sphere. And that truth from the government sphere also does need to be like echoed down through the public sphere. It's not the case that the two can be entirely separate. Does that help?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that the other thing is earlier in the talk you mentioned about nihilism and hedonism being the two options for people who don't have a sense of meaning, right? Like a kind of common definition of meaning to some extent.
No, what I meant is if we can't see a future for democracy, like if we can't see our way out of this situation, then let's just go and...
Okay, yeah, that's fine. And I think that the people, there's probably a significant portion of the population, so, see the future that you kind of described with a million different definitions, perhaps a million different definitions of their own truths, and kind of try, even if they can get along, these people don't want to see that in the future, and so either way they're going to, even if they can understand other views, they're going to kind of accept nihilism and hedonism as the result. So I can imagine there's already groups now, like you mentioned the Don. I think that on Reddit there are these like incels.
Yeah, they're real fun.
Going their own way. Yeah, literally there are men who don't want to talk to women at all, and they think that because of all the different philosophies which have come out in the last 100 years, they think that actually we should just abandon this project and go off and just kind of sit in your own corner and basically just pure nihilism. I think they kind of rely on the existence of a hegemonic ontology.
It's really interesting. I don't know. Incels are incels nihilistic. Well, I just say that incels are part of this whole fight, and go back to the idea that only 30% of the population, this is another kind of social science truth because it's existed since the 1960s when social science began. That's not true either. It existed in the 1890s.
Nazi leadership would be quoted as saying that, the Führer will say one thing one day and it will be true on that day, and then he'll contradict himself the following day, and then the contradiction will be true. And they they literally say that in quite an explicit way. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
That's a really good point. Thank you. That's a really good point. You wouldn't say that's necessarily part of their ideology, but you would. That definitely happens. So, no, but they wouldn't say that's like part of their philosophy. Do you see?
What, part of National Socialism?
Yes.
Is just believing.
Yes, absolutely.
Believe whatever the few say.
Yeah, yeah. But there's a consensus on that.
Yeah.
To be honest, no one's ever brought up that point before, so I need to think about it. Yeah, great point. But also, I'm just, yeah, don't know. Any other questions? Was that all right? Was that interesting? Cool. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, like I say, I am contactable. Say nice things about me on Twitter. And yeah, if you have got any questions, then email me.